Hi, my name is Ryan Martin, and the title of my presentation is American Standard English as a Hegemonic Social Construct, the reason for which is the assertion of the standard of any language as a hegemonic device. Standard American English is the idea that there exists an academic form of English used by members of the educated class. This dialect is supposedly free of colloquialism, phonetic deviation, is uniformly spoken by the culturally affluent. Many researchers would agree, though, that a pure dialect of any language is contradictory to its nature and a peculiar unlikelihood. Standard American English is therefore used to elevate some groups and discriminate against others. If SAE exists, those defined as non standard uses are either stigmatized as inferior or a pseudo perception of their linguistic differences is created. Their dialect is seen as different or less when really there may be few or no differences at all. In the authentic non standard dialects, there is an attempt to belittle their equal sophistication to those in power by marking them as less developed. This serves to define, maintain, and reinforce class distinctions. This presentation will explore these ideas to show SEA as a social construct to compare and exclude discriminated groups from mainstream society. Even in the early conception of the idea, SAE was hegemonic and difficult to define. According to the researcher Guy Jean Forge, the idea first came about in the 1761 letters of John Adams to Congress to establish norms for a uniform American English. The reason for this is, in his perspective, is that many early Americans were recent immigrants who spoke a variety of different language with different levels of literacy and influences of Native American place, plant, and animal names. John Adams appealed to that English was being corrupted by foreign influences and that these should be denounced. The act would have placed native speaking English immigrants and their descendants above any later arriving groups. The idea was rejected. In 1828, Merriam-Webster attempted to create normatives by writing the American Dictionary of the English Language, and this work was widely accepted. This particular edition shortly found its way into most schoolhouses and was merited as a standardized measure of literacy. Later editions, though, came into repeated dispute over more correct forms, and Ahern seems to answer why. Ahern conveys that a speech community is hard to identify. In the researcher's examination, the study she reflects on revealed that a people within a given population may share a lexicon, code switch, and change with contact with other groups. It becomes difficult to even define a community of like speakers because the use of language is in constant flux. To state that a higher or pure form of American English, set apart from all other dialects, exists becomes problematic because languages simply do not remain static. Forge agrees with this statement when he cites the assertions, language changes constantly, change is normal, spoken language is the language, correctness rests upon usage, and all usage is relative. Defining a language in one moment in time will therefore not fully apply shortly afterward. Any attempt to establish a uniform standard quickly becomes obsolete. Since it is a struggle to logically create this measure, SAE seeks to define itself by what it isn't. The idea of ebonics can be argued to have been created to validate its apparent opposite of SAE. The term was coined by the Oakland School District in 1996 as a dialect spoken by their African American student body. The district made this claim based on a study by W. Labov in 1972 that marked out this dialect with 4 grammatical markers. First of these traits was the deletion of copula and lack of inflection, which is not using the verb to be or conjugating based on register. Second was the simplification of coronal clusters, i.e., making words shorter by condensing them, like the case of the word all right becoming aight. The findings of this study were interpreted to support its claims, but were not without controversy. The findings of the Oakland study could be interpreted as inconclusive. Samples were taken from the states of California, Georgia, and Pennsylvania, but bore varying results. The markers were found in high incidence in some areas of densely populated African Americans, but subjects were also observed to code switch with non-black peers. Participants who were seen as having weak ties to community displayed a lack of markers, and those living in the areas of Los Angeles and northern Philadelphia displayed them very little or not at all. It's important to bring this up because Labob claimed that African Americans, due to their history of slavery and exclusion from literacy, were predisposed to this dialect. Like the unobjective studies of pidgins and creoles, Ebonics arrives at a point where it is apparent it sees the subject group through the lens of stigma. Labob finally implies that the use of African American vernacular English paired with historical segregation is one of the primary influences that create social conditions such as poverty, unemployment, reading failure, inadequate education, and high crime rates. The idea of Ebonics has two core problems. One, the assertion that the commonalities defined by Labov's studies substantiate a dialect is problematic. There is some base at a group that has historically been excluded from mainstream society and collectively set to the margin might have commonalities, but to assert that they would create their own linguistic dialect has certain flaws. The theory that languages such as those descended from Creoles in isolation means that African Americans as a whole would have had to have been completely separate from the general population of the country. A group so large would have had to have complete contact within itself in isolation from others. Historical exclusion aside, this case is not true. All members of the black demographic have experienced different levels of integration across regions. The idea that Ebonics could develop is not sufficiently substantiated. Secondly, the base logic of AAVE is hegemonic and therefore unobjective. Ebonics displays an effort to artificially separate African Americans from the affluent population, and this adds to the validity of the idea of SAE. The apparent absence of the affluent dialect in one group of speakers alludes to its own existence. This is a classist division attempting to make itself a racial one, therefore further uplifting its status. Speakers of SAE, being the white middle class and those who subscribe to the culture, due to their inherent experiences, are therefore better. The researcher Pullum, though, looked more closely at the differences cited in Labov's study. In response to the Oakland School Board's assertion, he found that these variations are not in fact inferior, but governed by logical and systematic rules. To say that one dialect is better than the other is clearly an attempt to define a power dynamic in American society, putting aside the dubiousness of either language form's existences. There are those who strongly subscribe to the idea of a more objective form of English, but the basis of their belief is built on a biased point of view. This aspect of their conviction discredits it. M. Buchholz conducted a study of socially outcast academians who were observed to employ the standard and superstandard forms of English. These markers were defined by the researcher as colloquially uncommon academic vernacular, the use of the formal register, and the avoidance of slang and unconventional syntax. This effort was meant to set themselves apart from their larger body of peers as successful, smart, and educated. This group is making a qualitative distinction to their own superiority. This idea is, of course, prejudice and loses intellectual weight. Another example can be seen when Ahern cites that the Chicago Manual of Style contests the correctness of the use of man to refer to all people due to gender bias, and that a good writer can find other ways to express this idea. This assertion implies that the notion of one essay is, even currently, not completely founded. Professor Anthea Fraser Gupta adds to this idea when she conveys that written dialects among English-speaking regions are often labeled as unconventional by some editors, but endorsed by others. The researcher cites that even the accepted spelling of unremarkable words such as committee can vary geographically. The claim for a uniformly conventional English is faulty and meant only to reinforce class distinctions. Standard American English is a fictitious idea that is more accurately seen as a hegemonic social construct. Language cannot be standardized because its natural change in usage lends itself to shifting forms. To assert such an idea is to resist this natural process because communication changes alongside people, populations, and society. Historically, the purpose behind the idea was solely to raise the human value of one group above the other. This is ethically wrong. The concept of SAE, then, should not be firmly maintained.